There are some cases that just stick with you, right? They get under your skin and stay there. And for over 2 decades, the disappearance of Laci Peterson has been one of those cases. It's a story about a beautiful pregnant mother who just vanished, a husband with a whole secret life, and a mystery that, believe it or not, is still playing out today. So in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. So picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 2002. Laci Peterson is 8 months pregnant, just weeks away from meeting her baby boy. And then she's gone. She disappears from her home, and the scene itself is quiet, almost eerily normal. But this moment right here, it's the start of a nationwide search and an absolute media firestorm. And that led to the one question on everyone's mind. What happened to Laci? It sounds like such a simple question, doesn't it? But the answer would be anything but. It's a question that completely captivated the country and would end up tearing a family apart. To really get a grip on how this whole thing spiraled out of control, we have to go back. Let's go back to that very first day, the critical hours when Laci disappeared. Okay, so this timeline is just crucial. At 9:30 in the morning, her husband, Scott Peterson, says he last saw her right before he left to go fishing. And this wasn't just a local trip. The Berkeley Marina is 90 miles away. Then, less than an hour later, a neighbor finds their dog just wandering around, leash and all, and puts him back in the yard. Fast forward to the afternoon, Scott leaves this pretty casual-sounding voicemail for Laci. And by 6 p.m., she's officially reported missing. Every single one of these moments would be picked apart for years. And back at their house, things just didn't add up. Laci was gone, but her keys, her wallet, her purse, all the stuff you'd take with you was still inside. It didn't look like she'd planned to leave. A massive search effort kicked off immediately, with the whole community involved. And through it all, Scott's story was consistent. He was out fishing. Well, as the days turned into weeks, the focus of the investigations started to narrow. It began shifting from, a tragic missing persons case to a potential homicide. And detectives started zeroing in on the one person closest to Laci. Now, publicly, things looked one way. Laci's family was actually defending Scott at first, telling everyone what a perfect couple they were. But behind the scenes, detectives were getting really suspicious. They described his demeanor as oddly calm and cool, and they noted he wasn't asking the kinds of questions a frantic, worried husband should be asking. And then the first big crack appeared in his story. He told some relatives he was golfing that day, which was a direct contradiction to his fishing alibi. And then the whole case just blew wide open. A woman named Amber Frey came forward. Turns out she'd started a relationship with Scott just a month before Laci disappeared. And the kicker? She had absolutely no idea he was married. It's absolutely chilling. 2 weeks before his pregnant wife went missing, Scott Peterson was telling his mistress that he was a widower. Think about that for a second. For prosecutors, this wasn't just a simple lie to cover up an affair. This was evidence of premeditation. This was the motive they were looking for. So Amber Frey realizes the man she's dating is at the center of this national nightmare. And she makes a really courageous decision. She went straight to the police, and she agreed to become their ears, secretly recording dozens and dozens of hours of her phone calls with Scott. For months, there was still this little glimmer of hope that Laci would be found safe. But in the spring of 2003, that hope was just extinguished in the most tragic way you can imagine. In April of 2003, human remains began washing ashore in the San Francisco Bay. First, the body of a baby boy. A day later, a woman's torso. DNA tests confirmed the absolute unthinkable. It was Laci and her unborn son, Connor. And here is the detail that became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The bodies were found right near the Berkeley Marina, the very same place Scott claimed to be fishing on Christmas Eve. With the bodies found, Scott Peterson was arrested almost immediately, and the case moved from a police investigation into the courtroom, setting the stage for one of the most watched trials of the century. Now, it's so important to remember this. The prosecution had no murder weapon, they had no confession, their entire case was circumstantial, built piece by piece like a giant puzzle. They had the motive, the affair with Amber Frey. They had the lies, fishing versus golfing. They had his bizarre behavior, like dyeing his hair and trying to sell their house. And they had these homemade concrete anchors he'd made, found in his boat, along with a single hair that matched Laci's DNA. The defense, of course, hammered on that lack of a smoking gun. They argued that the police got tunnel vision, that they zeroed in on Scott from day one and just ignored everything else. They challenged the science behind that single hair, and they even floated this alternative theory that Laci had been kidnapped by a satanic cult and murdered after she gave birth. But after a long, grueling trial, the jury decided that all those circumstantial pieces fit together perfectly. On November 12, 2004, they came back with their verdict: guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder for his wife, Laci, and guilty of second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. But that guilty verdict, it was far from the final chapter. In fact, it was just the beginning of a long and really complex series of legal battles over Scott Peterson's actual sentence. So initially, back in 2005, he was sentenced to death. And for 15 years, he sat on death row at San Quentin. But then, in 2020, the California Supreme Court stepped in and overturned his death sentence. Now, they didn't overturn the conviction. He was still legally guilty, just the sentence. They ruled the original trial judge made an error by improperly dismissing potential jurors. So a year later, he was officially resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And following that resentencing, in 2022, Scott Peterson was transferred off of death row for good. He's now serving his life sentence at Mule Creek State Prison in California, which is where he is today. And you might think, okay, that's finally the end of it. But amazingly, even after 2 decades, this story is still not over. In early 2024, a huge new player entered the ring: the LA Innocence Project. Now, this is a very well-respected legal group that works to exonerate people who've been wrongfully convicted. And their involvement has breathed all new life into Scott Peterson's claims that he's innocent. So, while a judge denied his request for a new trial back in 2022, the Innocence Project's involvement has already led to a pretty big development. Just in May of 2024, a judge agreed to allow new, more advanced DNA testing on a critical piece of evidence, a small piece of duct tape that was found on Laci's pants. Which brings us right up to today. A case that seemed closed for so long has been cracked open once again. For a story that has been defined by questions for 2 decades, the biggest one still remains. Is the final chapter of this story yet to be written?